My brother slammed me into the fridge so hard the tiles shook, then drove his knee into my face until blood streamed down my shirt. I was gasping, my vision blurred, reaching for the phone until my mother ripped it from my hands. "It's just a scratch," she hissed. My father didn't even look up. "Drama king," he muttered. In that moment I realized the pain wasn't just from the blow. It was from knowing they'd already decided I didn't matter. What they didn't know was that this time I wasn't going to stay silent. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love seeing how far my story can reach, and it reminds me that I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now let me tell you everything. If my story touches you, please subscribe to this channel. It means more than you know. I'm Ryan Carter, and for most of my life, my own family tried to silence me. But today, I'm ready to speak not just for myself, but for every child who was told their pain was just drama. Thanksgiving at my parents' house in Portland, Maine, always smelled like apple pie and wood smoke. The kind of postcard comfort that photographs well and lies even better. I stood on the front step with a bottle of store-bought cider and a smile that felt rented 31 years old. An ER nurse who can suture a split scalp with his eyes half closed and still somehow can't keep his hands steady around his family. The Colonial sits a street back from Casco Bay, the kind of house that cacks like it remembers everything. In the kitchen, the tiles were cold through my socks, the fluorescent tube over the sink flickering like a dying heartbeat. The old fireplace in the next room popping and sighing. Mom hummed over the stove. Dad angled the newspaper toward the light, and Derek leaned against the counter like a warning. "Did you bring the deed?" I asked, trying to make my voice casual, like we were talking about pie. I meant the quitclaim he'd promised to sign, the one that would finally make the little East End condo mine free and clear after years of family help that always came with strings. He smirked. "Pap work's boring, Zach. We'll talk later. Later has always been a cliff in my family." I felt my chest tighten. "You said before Thanksgiving." He rolled off the counter and stepped into my space, eyes bright with the old dare. "You calling me a liar?" Mom didn't look up. "Boys." Dad turned a page, the paper whispering. "I'm asking you to keep your word." I kept my hands at my sides where a patient couldn't see them shake. What happened next was both new and not new at all. Derek caught the front of my sweater and drove me back into the refrigerator so hard the magnets jumped and a postcard of Casco Bay slid to the floor. I heard the rubber gasket squeal, felt the steel hum against my spine. I had half a second to suck in air before his knee shot up and met my face. There was a crunch, like stepping on ice, and then heat, and then the floor tilted and my hands were wet. Blood threads spooled down my shirt and into the grout lines. I remember being more embarrassed than hurt, which is its own kind of wound. My silver chain, the one a hospice patient had pressed into my palm with a thank you, I didn't know how to hold, snapped and skittered across the tile, the pendant skipping like a coin and landing in a small red bloom. "Phone," I said through my palm. It came out like a plea and an order at once. I reached for the landline on the counter because my cell was in my coat. Mom's hand was faster. She yanked the receiver, slammed it down, and shot me a glance so sharp it could cut wire. "It's just a scratch," she snapped. "Don't ruin the holiday." Dad, without lifting his eyes, muttered, "Drama king, he's been saying it since I was 7. And Derek pushed me off the swing at the playground, and I came home with gravel in my knees since I was 9 and locked in the closet for time out long enough to fall asleep on my feet. In our house, being hurt was rude if it inconvenienced anyone else. I pressed a dish towel to my face and watched the red seep and spread. The room blurred. Derek was already pouring himself more wine. I waited for someone to say this was wrong, that I mattered enough to stop the bleeding or at least to look at it. No one did. I rinsed my mouth at the sink, the metal taste going thin and cold. and when the towel came away pink and lighter, I took my coat from the chair. The porch boards were hard and honest under my feet. Wind came off the lake with teeth threading the air with the smell of snow and old leaves. I stood under the dripping eave while the house glowed behind me, warm as a lie. I thought about the chain on the kitchen floor and the way it had looked when Mrs. Turner gave it to me. Her fingers bird-light, her voice steady. Keep something for yourself. Out in the cold breath, showing like proof I finally named the thing every holiday had been teaching me. They don't see me. Not as a son, not as a man, not as anything with weight. The realization hurt less than the knee had. It landed clean. The gash on my nose would clot. The other wound had waited years for air. I walked down the steps past the brittle hostas and the stained concrete and kept walking until the porch light was just a square behind me and the wind was loud enough to drown out the word that had followed me for half a life. Drama King. All it ever meant was, your pain is inconvenient to us. In the dark fingers sticky and throbbing, I made myself a promise I didn't say out loud because the sky would have heard it anyway. I wasn't going to be quiet this time. Back in Augusta, Maine, my apartment sits on the third floor of a brick building that looks over the Kennebec River. In November, the water skins with ice and moves anyway, stubborn under its new layer. I love that about it. I set my keys in the bowl by the door, flipped on the lamp, and the room breathed back books stacked along a sagging shelf, the thrift store armchair with one good arm. The window's black square reflecting a man with a swollen face. I showered with the water as hot as it would go and watched diluted red spin the drain like a trick. Then I stood in the mirror with a cheap contour palette and the steady hands I used to place IVs, and I learned how to lighten a bruise. The ER was full of Thanksgiving, which is to say, full of knives that slipped and ladders that didn't hold of too much wine and too little patience of people who raised their voices because they are less terrifying than what silence requires. My co-workers noticed. Grace took one look at my cheekbone and didn't pretend she hadn't. "Are you safe?" she asked while we changed linens, her voice the kind that makes people tell the truth. I said I was fine because that's a script my body knows, and because fine is a bridge you can stand on long enough to get to the other side. Anthony passed me a tray and didn't push. He just held my eyes for a beat. That was worse and better. In the staff bathroom during a lull, I locked the door and looked at what Derek had made of my face. Purple was beginning to bloom under my eye, a deepening storm. The cut across the bridge of my nose was neat. At least I'd aligned it in the shower. The fluorescent over the mirror was louder than the one at my parents' house, a rage of white. I took out my little spiral notebook, the one I use for vitals, and the notes that don't fit the chart, and I wrote in block letters, "Orbital bruise, minor laceration, assault by sibling." Saying it that way made it both colder and more real, like labeling a specimen you're tired of carrying in your hands. My shift broke me open in the way work sometimes does. One woman who'd fallen on ice. A kid with a fever that broke like a wave. A man who tried to carve his loneliness into manageable shapes with a bottle. When it ended, I didn't want to sleep. I drove north on the interstate under a sky like paper and turned onto the old street because I knew the house would be empty. My parents always go for a walk after dinner on the holiday weekend to walk off the pie, the same loop they've taken for decades. I have learned to time my entries. The attic still smelled like summer dust and winter hats. The pull string clicked, and the single bulb found the shape of boxes and decommissioned furniture. Mice had been here before me, tiny gnaw marks scalloping a boyhood trunk. I knelt on the floorboards and opened the cardboard coffin that used to be a life school photos, postcards from field trips, and envelope fat with negatives. The family album lay underneath its fake leather, cracked at the spine plastic sleeves hugging slick paper. I flipped to birthdays. There it was, my 9th. Except not because where my face would have been there was torn white. Someone had ripped me in half. The cake remained frosted chocolate. The words Ryan's Day scrolled in blue marker, slightly crooked because Aunt Diane's hand shook when she laughed. Balloons arched in the background. My sister's shoulder leaned into empty air. It's startling what a hole can do in a photograph. Your brain squints, tries to color me back, and fails. I ran my finger along the torn edge, and memory did the rest. I was 9, shoved into the hallway closet because I'd wanted the green plate instead of the blue one, because wanting anything in that house counted as a kind of theft. I remember the clove smell from Dad's winter coat and the snow crusted on boots melting into my socks. I remember the line of light under the door and the way Mom's steps slowed on the other side. Her shadow paused, narrow and knowable, the brushstroke of a person deciding. The hinge squeaked when she moved away. I took the half photo and slipped it into my bag with a care that felt like medical protocol. On the way out, I crouched on the kitchen floor and found my chain where the baseboard meets the tile, the pendant sticky with old red. I wrapped it in a napkin and put it with the picture with the kind of reverence I reserve for relics. Not because I worshipped the hurt, because I was finally treating it as evidence. At home, the river was a bright vein under the moon. I cleared the wall behind my desk, the one that didn't get much sun, and started pinning the life my parents preferred to remember a different way. The half photo went at the center. To its right, I taped the napkin-wrapped chain and made a note of the time and place I'd found it. Below that, my spiral page orbital bruise, minor laceration assault by sibling. On the left, I pinned a letter I'd found in another box years ago and never let myself read to the end. A note Derek wrote in a teenage scrawl with a joke I didn't understand then but heard perfectly now. You're worthless. It had been folded into my math book like a lesson. I stepped back. The wall looked like the beginning of a storm map, the kind I see on the news when a front is coming, and the colors shift from cool to catastrophic. But this one made a different kind of sense. Every scrap that used to feel like a private failure had a place now that made it larger than me. I added headings with blue tape, a nurse labeling vials, the closet, the swing, Thanksgiving. I drew a line between the torn photo and the chain, and then another between the chain and the words in my notebook. And as the lines met, I felt something rearrange under my ribs. It wasn't peace. It was permission. The next day at work, Grace asked me again if I was safe. I told her I was making myself so. She didn't press for details. She did what the best nurses do. She nodded like my answer had weight, and then asked if I wanted her extra granola bar. After shift change, I went home and wrote under the last empty space on the wall in block letters tall enough to see from the door the case against silence. Then I sat on the floor with my back to the radiator and read the words out loud to the empty room until they sounded like a vow. Everything about my parents' house is curated to prove we are a particular kind of family. The framed watercolor of the lake, the polished banister, the way the dining room chairs all match. In my apartment, the truth didn't match anything. It didn't need to. It could be a collage raw and uneven, a constellation of things that had happened and a handful of things I would not let happen again. Outside, the river moved under its glass. Inside, a nurse who had spent a decade documenting other people's wounds finally started to chart his own. And for the first time since Thanksgiving, when I turned off the lamp and the room went dark, I didn't feel like the house in Portland, Maine had the last word. I did. The next time I drove back to Portland, Maine, the snow had already begun to crust along the edges of the road, the salt trucks leaving pale scars behind them. I carried a bundle of wildflowers from the co-op, their stems wrapped in damp paper, and tried to convince myself they might soften the table. The house looked the same as it always had in winter, the wreath pressed flat against the door, the porch light buzzing faintly. Inside, the smell of roast chicken and nutmeg was thick in the air. But the weight in the room wasn't hunger. It was the kind of silence that settles in families when everyone has already chosen sides. I set the flowers down in the center of the table. Linda gave them a single glance and smirked, her voice carrying across the plates. "Lucky Derek puts up with you." It wasn't even hidden as a joke. Derek grinned, fork-tapping against his glass, his eyes finding mine like he wanted me to answer and lose. I said nothing. When the teapot hissed, he reached across in a sudden movement that looked careless to anyone who wanted to believe it. The kettle tipped, and a stream of boiling water arced across the table and splashed down my thigh. The heat bit through fabric in a blink. I jerked back, but the pain already bloomed sharp and searing. Linda clucked her tongue. "You shouldn't have sat so close." She didn't ask if I was burned, didn't look at the skin rising under the fabric. Dad saw it at his chicken, unbothered. Maya's eyes flickered between us and then dropped to her plate. The conversation rolled on as if nothing had happened. Derek making a show of telling stories from his job. Linda laughing too loudly. At one point, Derek leaned back in his chair and said, "Remember when Ryan locked himself in the closet, screamed like the house was on fire?" Linda laughed, correcting him. "He wasn't locked in. He just wanted attention." The table joined in the word "drama king," circling like a toast. They were laughing at the night I'd begged to be let out the line of light under the door, my only proof the world still existed. My skin burned and the laughter made it hotter. I excused myself, limping to the bathroom, shutting the door against the sound. Pulling off my pants, I looked at the angry red patch spreading across my thigh. Blisters threatened the edges already. I ran cool water over it, hissing when the sting flared. The mirror caught my face pale and set, and the sight of myself treating my own wound in the same house that caused it struck harder than the burn itself. These marks were evidence, not metaphors, not exaggerations. Proof that every denial had been a lie. From behind the bathroom door, Maya's voice came soft, almost guilty. "Let it go, Zach. It's not worth it." She didn't wait for my answer. Her footsteps faded back to the table. I pressed a clean towel against my thigh and realized she wasn't warning me for my sake. She was warning me not to disturb the balance that kept everyone else comfortable. Silence was their shelter, and they wanted me to crawl back into it with them. When I finally pulled on my coat and stepped outside. The night air was sharp, the snow crunching under my shoes. The windows glowed behind me, laughter spilling faintly into the cold. For the first time, I didn't feel the pull to turn back to beg for a seat at the table. I stood at the edge of the driveway, thigh throbbing, and whispered it to myself like a vow. This is the last time. I would not walk back into that house again as a willing participant. Whatever came next, I would not be their silence anymore. Back in Augusta, Maine, the snow kept falling soft and relentless, blanketing the streets in white that glowed under the street lamps. My apartment smelled of coffee grounds and damp wool. I dragged out the old boxes I'd tucked into the closet, the kind you save but don't open because you already know what's inside. Tonight, I wanted it open. I needed to see everything. The first stack held school notebooks, letters folded in uneven squares. Among them, I found Derek's handwriting. Angry slashes of ink across lined paper. One note smeared from age read, "No one will believe you, not even Mom." I traced the words with my thumb, the edges of the paper soft from years of being handled or avoided. It wasn't a taunt. It was a prophecy he knew would hold. He was right for too long. That same night, an envelope slid under my door. The handwriting was careful, almost formal. Inside was a letter from Laura Bennett, my old music teacher, the one who once stopped me in 9th grade to ask if I was okay when I tried to hide the bruises on my wrist with a sweatband. She had enclosed a photocopy of a page from her journal dated that year, describing how she had seen the bruise, how she had almost called the authorities, and how my parents had threatened to sue her if she did. Her letter said simply, "I should have spoken then. I won't stay silent now." We met at a cafe in town the next evening, the windows fogged from the steam of coffee machines. Laura's hair was silver now, her eyes tired but steady. She folded her hands on the table and said, "I let fear silence me. I won't do it again. If you need me to testify, I will." Her words landed heavier than the snow outside. They felt like the first real ally stepping onto the map. When I returned to my apartment, the hallway light flickered. Robert was waiting at my door. His shoulders filled the frame, his coat still dusted with snow. "Stop digging," he said as soon as I reached him. "You're a burden. No one needs your drama." His voice was low, but carried the weight of command, the voice that had taught me obedience before I had language for it. Then he leaned in and added, "We still have the records. You really want people to know how unstable you were." The words hit a place I had tried to bury. Memories surfaced sharp as glass the night at 16 when Derek shoved me down the basement stairs, and I spent hours in the ER with a concussion, only to find weeks later that my chart listed me under behavioral incident. The file had been doctored. My pain turned into instability. I had doubted my own memory for years. Now I knew. They had rewritten me on paper to protect themselves. I unlocked the door and told him to leave. He stood there for a long moment, eyes narrowing, but when he saw the resolve in my face, he turned and disappeared down the stairs. My hands shook as I shut the door behind him. But the shaking wasn't fear anymore. It was fury that had finally found oxygen. I spread the new documents across my desk, the note from Derek Laura Bennett's journal page, the memories that now had proof. I photographed each one carefully, filed them into a folder on my computer labeled Project Witness, and backed them up on a drive I kept hidden. Every click of the camera felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been stolen. When I pinned Laura's letter to the wall beside the torn birthday photo and the blood-stained chain, the constellation of evidence widened. Each piece was a point of light in a dark sky, small alone but undeniable together. The burn on my leg still stung. The bruise on my face was yellowing, but the wall in front of me was growing into something larger than pain. It was a record no one could erase. I sat in the armchair by the window watching snow collect on the frozen river. The city was quiet, the only sound the hum of the radiator. My father's threat echoed in my ears, but this time it didn't land the way he intended. The records he wielded like weapons were false, and I had begun to collect the truth. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving their violence. I was building the case against their silence. Harbor Light calf smelled the same as it had years ago. Dark roast and toasted bread, and a faint sweetness from the baked goods that never lasted long in the case. The light was golden, the kind of light that softened everything but couldn't soften the weight sitting across from me. Erin Walters stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking gently, her eyes searching mine with a hesitation that told me she was carrying more than small talk. "I wouldn't have asked you here if it wasn't important," she said finally. "It's Chloe." The name made something tighten in my chest. Derek's daughter, 9 years old. A child who still laughed with missing teeth the last time I saw her. Erin's voice dropped lower. "She came to school with a bruised wrist, said her dad pushed her when she got in the way. When I asked more, she said he called her a drama queen. Said she was just like you." The words landed like a blade turned in an old wound. I didn't need her to say more. I could see it. The small body shoved aside the name spit out as if it stripped her of the right to cry. I had lived at every syllable, every dismissal, every bruise denied until even I questioned if they were real. "She's 9, I said quietly, almost to myself. Erin Walters nodded. "I reported it. Child services came, but your parents told them Chloe tripped, that she makes up stories. They closed the case." I sat back, the cafe warm around me while my skin went cold. The silence of adults had once turned my pain invisible. Now it was happening again, except this time to a little girl who had no shield, but the very people cutting her down. My phone buzzed. A message from Maya. "Don't involve Chloe. Don't repeat your drama." My hands tightened around the device. It was the same pattern, the same plea for quiet that had bound me for decades. Their comfort demanded our silence. I looked at Erin, her face pale but steady. If I stay quiet, she pays the price I said. The words came out more certain than I felt, but they hung there true anyway. That night, I drove to Casco Bay. The sky was low and heavy, the air sharp enough to bite the inside of my nose. The surface of the bay had frozen into a jagged sheet, pale and fractured. I walked to the edge and stared at the cracks, the dark water shifting beneath. My reflection blurred with the ice, older but not different enough. I thought of Chloe's small wrist, her confused eyes when pain was renamed imagination. The line of silence stretched from me to her, a rope tied to generations. Either I cut it here, or she carried it into her own life until it strangled her too. The wind howled across the water, rattling the trees, and I let it tear through me. I had lived my whole life being told my injuries were exaggerations, my voice too loud, my truth too messy. But Chloe was only 9. She hadn't learned to question herself yet. If no one stood for her now, she would learn too quickly. I leaned forward, breath turning white, and let the thought burn through the cold. I would not let her story become mine. Snow fell hard the evening I carried the pie to Portland, Maine. The box was warm against my gloves, a disguise of sweetness over the bitterness I brought with me. The kitchen light flickered as always, the tiles shining slick underfoot. Linda and Robert sat at the table like statues, the air already thick with suspicion. I set the box down, pulled out the chair across from them, and sat. Neighbors murmured. Teachers I remembered by face more than name took their seats. Derek tilted his chin at me with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Chloe sat 2 rows from the front beside Maya, legs swinging too still for a child. When Linda's name was called, she rose with practiced gray smile bright enough to be mistaken for kindness. The applause was dutiful and warm. She reached the podium, fingers resting on the wood as if it belonged to her. I stepped into the aisle and felt the hush ripple. I didn't wait for anyone to invite me. I walked to the front, set my bag on a chair, and faced the room with my heart hammering but my voice clean. "I have something you need to hear," I said, and pressed play on the recorder. Linda's voice filled the nave, sharp and unmistakable. "Do you want to end up broken like him?" Chloe's cry followed, small and strangled, then the click of a lock, the thud of a door. The sound seemed louder between stone walls, the way truth grows when it has nowhere else to go. For a breath, the whole room forgot to breathe. Linda froze at the podium color, draining eyes cutting toward Chloe and then to me. I moved to the lectern and opened the laptop I'd brought. The external drive sliding into place with a small click that sounded to me like a latch opening. On the screen, I placed photos. The yellowed image of my 9th birthday with my torn-out face. Recent shots of my bruised cheekbone and the burn on my thigh. The napkin-wrapped silver chain cataloged and time-stamped. I held up a letter in Derek's adolescent scroll and read the line that had haunted my skin for years. "No one will believe you, not even Mom." Then I projected the page Laura Bennett had sent, a dated entry from her 9th grade classroom describing the bruise on my wrist, the threat of a lawsuit if she spoke. Robert surged to his feet, a folder already in his hand, as if he had rehearsed this moment in a mirror. "Our son has been unstable for years," he said, lifting papers stamped and labeled, the tidy handwriting of a fiction disguised as medicine. "This is tragic," but a woman stood in the aisle before I could answer. Dr. Karen Patel, dark coat, hospital badge, still clipped to her lapel. "Those records are falsified," she said, voice ringing with the clarity of a clean incision. "I have reviewed the originals, and I will testify to the alterations. This is not a diagnosis. It is a cover." The whisper that followed wasn't scandal. It was recognition dots connecting across years no one had dared to map. From the 4th row, Laura Bennett rose, hands shaking and steady at once. "I was warned to keep quiet," she said. "I didn't. I failed him then. I won't fail this child now." She looked at Chloe when she said it. Other voices answered a neighbor who had heard shouting through winters when the windows were closed. A former teacher who remembered the way I'd winced when a hand landed too hard on my shoulder. A coach who'd been told I was dramatic when I excused myself to throw up after a hit to the ribs. Each voice found the next like lit wicks passing flame. The room's temperature changed. It wasn't warmer, but it was less cold. Maya's face crumpled her gaze, skipping from me to Chloe and back. Derek stared at the floor like an answer might be written there. Linda gripped the podium hard enough to blanch her knuckles. I reached into my coat and set the cracked teacup on the lectern where the microphone could catch it when porcelain touched wood. The fracture lines shone like veins. Every crack holds the truth you tried to bury. I said the word steady as a counted pulse. Tonight, I pour it all back. The back doors opened and uniformed officers stepped in quiet and professional, the way people move when they are carrying the weight of someone else's decisions. An investigator approached Linda and Robert spoke softly, then turned to me with a small nod, as if to say the record was finally louder than the rumor. The cuffs were discreet jackets draped to cover the metal, but there was no covering the sound their steps made on the stone aisle. No one applauded, no one jeered. The room watched and listened as the lie that had held us all in place came apart in the open. Chloe reached for my hand as they passed. Her fingers were cold, and I squeezed once a promise that wasn't words. The teacup sat between us on the wood like an altar to the plainest possible thing what happened named and seen. Outside, the sky had thinned from slate to milk. Inside, the silence finally belonged to those who needed it, the children who'd been told to hush. I gathered my drive and the chain of evidence I'd built piece by piece. And for the first time in my life, I walked out of that church without the feeling that something behind me had the right to call me back. Maine lay hushed under a thick layer of snow. The rooftop softened, the river sealed in glassy silence. Inside my apartment, the radiator clanged faintly while the smell of tea drifted through the small kitchen. On the table, I set down 2 cups, the old one fractured and fragile, its lines spidering like veins, and the new one glazed blue with forget-me-nots circling the rim. They looked strange side by side, one carrying the weight of history, the other the promise of what might follow, but together they told the truth more honestly than words could. When I visited Chloe at the children's shelter, the building felt tired but cared for, with bright posters tacked to the walls and a warmth that didn't depend on pretense. She sat curled in a beanbag with a book balanced on her knees. I placed both cups on the low table near her and knelt down so our eyes met. "This one is what happened," I said, touching the cracked porcelain. "It will always exist, and this one is for everything that comes after." She traced a finger around the blue flowers, her eyes wide. "Do I have to drink from the broken one?" she whispered. "No," I told her gently. "But you don't have to pretend it was never part of the set." Later that week in the courthouse hallway, I signed the papers Paula Reed prepared for temporary guardianship. Her calm steadied me. "We'll make sure her story doesn't get buried like yours was," she said. Walking out into the cold, reporters clustered nearby, one called, "Why now?" I stopped, met her gaze, and said, "Because no one asked how I was doing back then, and I won't let that silence define her." The words felt lighter than the breath that carried them, yet heavy enough to hold the years behind me. That evening, a detective returned the silver chain I'd thought was lost. It had been cleaned, the pendant catching the lamplight as he placed it in my palm. "This belongs with you," he said. I fastened it around my neck, the cool metal settling like a promise I could finally keep. At my desk, I opened my worn spiral notebook to the final page. In block letters, I wrote things I was told never to say. Beneath it, a single line: "Silence isn't my legacy." I closed the book but left the pen resting there as if the story was still being written. I set the two cups side by side on the table once more. Outside, the Kennebec River glimmered under ice, the current pushing beneath, invisible but unstoppable. The first light of morning spread over the horizon, pale and steady. For years I had carried wounds no one acknowledged. Now there was proof of child's safety and a chance for something different. Chloe would grow up knowing her voice mattered. I would no longer stand outside my family's house hoping for recognition. Instead, I stood here in this small apartment with its view of the frozen river and felt the quiet certainty that we had stepped out from their shadow. The broken cup would always be there, but beside it was something whole, something new. And for the first time, that balance felt like